I know we do mention too many names in thank you speeches, so I'll only mention a few.
For decades, Aubrey Hepburn was the definition of perfection. She was graceful, gentle, and a treat to watch on screen. But in 1978, a little-known interview cracked that image wide open. In it, Audrey quietly admitted things she had never allowed herself to say before. The fact that her childhood wasn't nearly as glamorous as the life she lived after becoming a Hollywood icon. But even then, her family history cast a shadow she just couldn't escape, because fame couldn't heal the sadness she'd carried her entire life. So, what happened to Aubrey Hepburn? And why does no one remember a confession she made on her own? Let's find out. The true interview Hollywood forgot. In 1978, when Audrey Hepburn sat down for what would later be described as a lost interview, she was no longer the star Hollywood had carefully packaged in the 1950s. She was nearly 50, living mostly in Europe, long removed from the studio system that had once defined her entire existence. The interview wasn't staged to promote a film, and that's exactly why it mattered. At the time, the world believed it already knew Audrey Hepburn. She was a woman who floated through life with grace, good manners, and impeccable taste. Interviews from her Hollywood years reinforced that image relentlessly. Audrey was polite, grateful, and self-effacing in a way that reassured audiences she hadn't changed despite her fame. When asked about hardship, she softened it. When asked about pain, she redirected the conversation toward gratitude. She had learned very early that the public didn't want complexity from her. They wanted the image of someone they could aspire to be. But this forgotten interview felt different from the first moment. Her voice was quieter, and she wasn't in a rush to get things over with. There was none of the performative sparkle that had once accompanied her answers. Instead of charming deflection, there was hesitation. Instead of anecdotes carefully polished for magazines, there were pauses, moments where it felt like she was deciding, in real time, how much truth she was willing to release. And for the first time, she stopped protecting the life that Hollywood had curated for her. Audrey openly admitted something she had rarely acknowledged before. She had never believed in herself, not in her looks, and definitely not in her talent, the qualities people appreciated her for the most. She spoke of her success as something external, results she could see, awards she could accept, but never something she fully internalized. That alone was startling. This was a woman who had become one of the most recognizable faces of the 20th century, quietly admitting that she never felt worthy of it. But the interview didn't stop there. Without drama or accusation, Audrey allowed fragments of her past to surface, details that had long been erased from her public narrative. She acknowledged the moral weight of her family's political history in the 1930s. She spoke, with restraint but clarity, about surviving Nazi-occupied Europe as a teenager. And she referenced relationships that had shaped her life in ways Hollywood biographies rarely dared to explore honestly. What made these admissions so powerful wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. There was no attempt to sensationalize her suffering, no bitterness or need to shock people. Instead, there was a sense of reckoning, as if she had reached a point in life where withholding the truth no longer served her. The woman speaking in 1978 wasn't trying to protect a career or preserve a carefully curated image. That work was already done. The films were already immortal. The icon was already secure. So why speak now? That question hangs over the entire interview, even today. By 1978, Audrey had already stepped away from Hollywood in any meaningful sense. Her priorities had shifted decisively toward family and humanitarian work. She had experienced love, betrayal, motherhood, loss, and repeated reinvention. She had also lived long enough to understand that the version of herself the world adored was only part of the story, and perhaps the least important part. But her career had been shaped by expectation. Audrey was aware of what people wanted from her, and for decades she gave it to them. But this interview lacked that transactional quality. It felt less like a performance and more like a release, as though she finally allowed herself to say, "This is what it actually cost me." Equally shocking was what she didn't say outright. She never framed herself as a victim. She didn't blame Hollywood, her parents, or the men she loved. Yet the silences between her words suggested years of restraint, years of swallowing grief, choosing composure over confession. When she spoke about walking away from fame, she didn't frame it as noble or self-sacrificial. She framed it as necessary. To her, it was survival. Because the interview wasn't about nostalgia or regret. It was about truth, carefully measured, but unmistakably present. Audrey wasn't trying to rewrite her legacy. She was trying, perhaps for the first time, to claim it on her own terms. And that's what made the interview so easy to forget and so dangerous to remember. It didn't fit the story Hollywood preferred. It complicated the icon. It suggested that beneath the grace and beauty was a woman shaped by war, insecurity, and quiet endurance. A woman who had learned that silence could be a form of protection, but also a form of erasure. So the interview faded. It wasn't replayed endlessly. It wasn't quoted in glossy retrospectives. But for those who listen closely, it offers something rare. Audrey Hepburn, no longer performing, finally telling the truth. And once you hear it, it becomes impossible not to ask the question that changes everything. Why did Audrey Hepburn feel the need to tell her story only after she had walked away from the world that made her famous? Hollywood's version of Aubrey Long. Before Audrey Hepburn ever felt safe enough to speak honestly, the world had already decided who she was supposed to be. Hollywood didn't just make Audrey famous, it finished her. By the early 1950s, the industry had locked her into an image that felt almost untouchable. Elegance without effort, beauty without vanity, charm without ambition. She wasn't marketed as passionate or dangerous or complicated. She was presented as reassuring, safe. A woman audiences could adore without ever feeling challenged. Essentially, she was the stereotypical leading lady who was all looks and no brains. And Audrey understood that instinctively. Unlike many stars of her era, she didn't fight the image. She learned how to make it work for her. And that proved to be a smart move. Because the moment Audrey stopped being palatable, the entire fantasy risked collapsing. What made the myth so powerful was how convincingly it erased struggle. The public saw a woman who appeared untouched by ego or ambition, gliding from Roman Holiday to Sabrina to breakfast at Tiffany's as if success simply followed her around. But what they didn't see was how tightly that image constrained her. Audrey wasn't allowed complexity of any kind. Hollywood needed her to be timeless, not truthful. Even her physical appearance became part of the mythology. In an era obsessed with curves and overt sensuality, Audrey's slim frame and understated presence were framed as something pure and different. But that difference came with expectations. She wasn't supposed to hunger for more. She wasn't supposed to be angry. And she certainly wasn't supposed to be sad. Yet privately, Audrey felt like an outsider everywhere she went. She wasn't American. She hadn't grown up in Hollywood. She carried a European accent, wartime memories, and a worldview shaped by deprivation rather than abundance. While other actresses were navigating contracts and publicity battles, Audrey was still grappling with whether she even belonged on a screen at all. Fame only amplified all those insecurities. Audrey often spoke later in life about feeling fundamentally undeserving, not just of praise, but of love. She compared herself unfavorably to other women, actresses especially. She worried she was too plain, too thin, too awkward, too much of an anomaly. Even as designers built entire fashion houses around her silhouette, she privately wished she looked different, more conventional, more acceptable. That contradiction, being celebrated while feeling invisible, became one of the defining tensions of her life. What made it worse? was that the myth left no room for contradiction. Audrey Hepburn wasn't supposed to have political baggage. She wasn't supposed to come from a morally compromised family. She wasn't supposed to have survived starvation or fear or moral confusion during the war. Those details didn't fit the story of effortless grace, so they were quietly pushed aside. And Audrey let them be. For years, she spoke about World War II in vague terms. She acknowledged hardship, but not horror. She referenced hunger, but not desperation. She never centered herself as someone who had survived trauma, only as someone who had been through a difficult time. That careful phrasing mattered. It allowed her to remain intact as an icon with essentially no backstory. But it also required silence. By the time of the 1978 interview, Audrey had lived long enough with that silence to understand its cost. The myth had protected her, but it had also erased who she was as a person and the experiences that shaped her. This is why the interview mattered so much. It's where Audrey stopped performing gratitude and started acknowledging grief, where she allowed herself to be seen not as a symbol, but as a person shaped by contradiction. Because before she could explain why she walked away from Hollywood, she had to dismantle the illusion that there was nothing to walk away from. An unstable childhood. To understand what Audrey Hepburn would later struggle to say out loud, you have to start with the world she was born into. A world already fractured by contradiction. Audrey Hepburn entered life in 1929, between borders, identities, and ideologies that never quite aligned. Her family background looked impressive on paper, European, cultured, well-connected. But beneath that polish was instability, emotional, moral, and political, that would shape her long before Hollywood ever found her. Her father, Joseph Rustin, was charismatic and distant, a man Audrey adored and feared losing in equal measure. Her mother, Ella van Heemstra, came from Dutch nobility and carried a fierce sense of discipline and pride. In the 1930s, both parents were drawn, at least briefly, toward fascist ideology. It's one of the most uncomfortable truths of Audrey's story, and it makes sense as to why Hollywood didn't want people to know that about her. Her mother didn't just flirt with dangerous ideas from afar. She attended Nazi gatherings, met Adolf Hitler in 1935, and wrote articles that praised the movement before the full scale of its brutality became undeniable. Later in life, Ella would deeply regret this chapter of her past. But for Audrey, the knowledge lingered like a stain she couldn't wash away, especially as history unfolded in the most brutal way imaginable. The family's instability wasn't just political. When Audrey was 6 years old, her father vanished. No explanation, no goodbye. Audrey's mother told her he had gone on a trip, that he would return. He never did. Young Audrey wrote letters to him constantly, letters that were never sent, because no one knew where he was. That abandonment cut deeply, leaving a wound Audrey herself would later describe as the most painful experience of her life. As Europe edged closer to war, Audrey's childhood became all the more unstable. She lived in Brussels, London, and The Hague. The constant movement gave her languages and adaptability, but it also robbed her of roots. She learned early how to adjust, how to blend in, how not to take up too much emotional space. When World War II broke out in 1939, her mother made what she believed was a protective decision, moving the family back to the Netherlands, assuming neutrality would keep them safe. Instead, it placed them directly in the path of Nazi occupation. Audrey was 11 when German troops invaded the Netherlands in May 1940. Overnight, comfort vanished. Fear became routine, and moral ambiguity became impossible to ignore. The war didn't arrive for Audrey as abstract politics. It arrived as very real consequences. Her uncle was executed by the Nazis for resistance activities, a loss that shattered any remaining illusions about safety or neutrality. From that point on, childhood was over. The family relocated to Velp, where daily life became a calculation of risk and scarcity. Bombings at night, hiding during the day, lines for food that often ended in nothing. Disease is spreading through communities already weakened by hunger. Audrey watched adults grow thinner, quieter, more desperate. And then came the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945. Food supplies collapsed entirely. People survived on as few as 400 calories a day. Audrey's once privileged family was reduced to eating tulip bulbs, weeds, and grass, anything that could quiet the pain of starvation. At 15, Audrey was so malnourished she developed anemia, edema, and long-term damage to her body. Dancing, her first great love, became impossible. This was the first time she felt robbed of her identity. Ballet had been Audrey's refuge, her dream, her sense of control in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet. But as the hunger deepened, her body could no longer sustain the disciplined dance required. Her strength faded, her balance weakened. Eventually, she had to stop altogether. The cold made everything worse. With no heat, the family spent much of the winter huddled in cellars, sharing space with neighbors, listening to bombs fall overhead. Disease spread rapidly through weakened communities, and Audrey, like everyone else, received painful injections to prevent typhus. Survival became mechanical. Eat if you can. Hide if you must. Endure. These months left marks that never fully healed. Long after the war ended, Audrey struggled with chronic fatigue, digestive issues, and lingering health problems doctors could trace back to starvation. Even later in life, when food was abundant, her body reacted as if scarcity could return at any moment. That vigilance, physical and emotional, never left her. What makes this chapter of her life even more striking is what she chose to do with it. At an age when most teenagers were simply trying to survive, Audrey quietly joined the Dutch resistance and did whatever she could. At that age, she delivered underground newspapers hidden in her socks. She performed in silent ballet recitals so quiet that the audience couldn't clap to raise money for people in hiding. At one point, she narrowly avoided arrest by Nazi police by pretending to be an innocent girl picking flowers. This wasn't bravery for applause. No one was watching. No one would ever know. And for years, almost no one did. After the war ended, Audrey received food and medical aid from organizations that would later become UNICEF. That moment, being saved after months of starvation, never left her. But neither did the shame, confusion, and guilt she carried from surviving when so many didn't. This was the emotional landscape Audrey carried into adulthood. A child shaped by abandonment, a teenager shaped by hunger and fear, a young woman who had seen ideology turn lethal and privilege evaporate overnight. It's no coincidence that later in life, she distrusted certainty, avoided excess, and struggled to believe she deserved safety or happiness. And when Hollywood tried to erase her story, her fears were only validated. The girl who fought against all odds. When the war ended, Audrey Hepburn did not step into a fairy tale. She stepped into uncertainty. The Netherlands was liberated in 1945, but Audrey's body and future were still damaged by years of deprivation. Her childhood dream of becoming a prima ballerina was already slipping away. She would never have the physical strength required for a professional ballet career. But Audrey didn't abandon movement. She adapted. After the war, she continued studying ballet in Amsterdam under Sonja Gaskell, one of the Netherlands' leading instructors. Audrey worked obsessively hard, but she was realistic. She could dance beautifully, but not powerfully enough to compete with dancers who had trained uninterrupted throughout the war. Gaskell herself later acknowledged that Audrey lacked the physical foundation for a long ballet career, not because of talent, but because of starvation. So Audrey made a quiet, practical decision. If she couldn't dance professionally, she would perform in other ways. To support her mother, who was struggling financially, Audrey began taking small modeling jobs. She appeared in advertisements. She worked as a chorus dancer in musical reviews. These weren't glamorous opportunities, They were survival jobs, but they placed her in front of audiences for the first time without the pressure of perfection ballet demanded. In 1948, Audrey was cast in a small role in the Dutch film Dutch in 7 Lessons. Her part was minor, almost forgettable, but it introduced her to filmmaking, and more importantly, it gave her the confidence to consider acting seriously. Soon after, Audrey moved to London. London in the late 1940s was still recovering from the war, but it was alive with creative opportunity. Audrey enrolled in acting classes, supported herself with modeling, and began auditioning for stage roles. She was inexperienced and insecure, but she had something that casting directors couldn't quite name, a presence that felt honest rather than theatrical. Her breakthrough came not through Hollywood, but through European theater. While performing in a small revue, she was noticed by the French novelist Colette, who was searching for a young actress to play the title role in the stage adaptation of Gigi. When Colette saw Audrey, she famously declared, "I've found my Gigi." Audrey was terrified, though. She had never carried a stage production on her own. She doubted her voice. She doubted her ability to act. But Colette insisted, and Audrey committed herself completely, memorizing lines relentlessly, rehearsing endlessly, fighting the belief that she didn't belong there. When Gigi opened in New York, critics were stunned. Audrey Hepburn, this unknown, foreign, untrained girl by Hollywood standards, had become the quiet center of the production. Reviews praised her naturalism, her vulnerability, her lack of artifice. It wasn't flashy. It was disarming. That performance changed everything. In 1951, she was cast in Roman Holiday. The role of Princess Anne had initially been considered for established stars, but director William Wyler was struck by Audrey's screen test. Even after filming ended, he kept the camera rolling as she spoke about her life, her experiences during the war, and her uncertainty about acting. That footage mattered more than the audition itself. Wyler later said it wasn't just her beauty that convinced him. It was her authenticity, the way she listened, reacted, and didn't take herself so seriously. When Roman Holiday was released in 1953, it was an immediate success. Audrey's performance felt revolutionary, and almost overnight, the girl who had once hidden from Nazi patrols became an international star. And if you think about it, Roman Holiday could not be more symbolically perfect. It's a film about a woman forced to play a role who gets one day of freedom to be ordinary, honest, human, before returning to the image the world requires. Audrey made that transformation look effortless, but the film's hidden history suggests something darker. Sometimes the most beloved stories are built on omissions that people find convenient. The choice to leave. By the early 1960s, Audrey Hepburn had reached a level of stardom few actors ever experience. Her face represented a very specific idea of femininity, refinement, and moral clarity at a time when Hollywood desperately needed it. Film after film reinforced that image, and audiences embraced it completely. That wasn't all, though. Audrey Hepburn's filmography is often described in terms of style, clothes, silhouettes, elegance, but that framing misses what actually made her extraordinary on screen. Her greatest performances worked because she underplayed emotion in an era obsessed with excess. While many stars projected intensity outward, Audrey pulled audiences inward. Audrey Hepburn was compelling because she didn't act at the camera. She listened. She reacted. She trusted silence. And in doing so, she created performances that still feel modern because they were never about display. Her range is most evident in films people forget to mention. In Wait Until Dark, she strips away elegance entirely, playing vulnerability as terror, not fragility. It earned her one of her final Oscar nominations and proved she could command suspense just as powerfully as romance. That same instinct defined Sabrina. The transformation audiences remember isn't just visual, It's internal. Audrey made Sabrina's growth believable by letting confidence arrive gradually, imperfectly. She never rushed the arc, and that's why everyone fell in love with her. Even in something as culturally overwhelming as Breakfast at Tiffany's, Audrey anchored the film emotionally. Beneath the glamour, Holly Golightly is anxious, defensive, and deeply afraid of being owned by people or by circumstance. Audrey's performance works because she lets those contradictions coexist. She never simplifies Holly into charm alone. But Audrey's relationship with her career had always been complicated. She never saw acting as a conquest or a ladder to climb. To her, it was something provisional, an opportunity she was grateful for, but never fully comfortable inside. With each new role, the gap widened between how she was perceived and how she felt. The more iconic she became, the less room there was for error, vulnerability, or change. For someone the world perceived as endlessly adored, Audrey Hepburn spent much of her adult life searching for emotional security rather than romance. Her relationships were rarely casual and almost never easy. Each one reflected a different version of what she hoped love might provide: stability, partnership, or simply safety. Audrey's first great love was actor William Holden, whom she met while filming Sabrina. Their connection was intense and genuine, but it ended abruptly when Audrey learned Holden had undergone a vasectomy. For her, this wasn't a negotiable detail. She wanted children deeply, and the realization that motherhood wouldn't be possible with him devastated her. Years later, Holden would call Audrey the love of my life, but by then, the cost had already been paid. In 1954, Audrey married actor and director Mel Ferrer. Their relationship was intellectually charged, but emotionally fraught. Ferrer, older and more controlling, often influenced Audrey's career decisions, sometimes encouraging her to turn down roles that might have reshaped her trajectory. During their marriage, Audrey suffered multiple miscarriages, experiences that quietly deepened her resolve to one day prioritize family over work. Their marriage ended in 1968 after years of strain, emotional distance, and infidelity on both sides, making it one of the most devastating love stories Hollywood has ever seen. Audrey became a mother for the first time in 1960 with the birth of her son, Sean Ferrer, whose father was Mel Ferrer. Sean's arrival changed everything. Audrey immediately restructured her life around him, reducing her film commitments and retreating from Hollywood's demands. For her, motherhood wasn't something to balance alongside fame, it was something that replaced it. Her second son, Luca Dotti, was born in 1970. His father was Italian psychiatrist Andrea Dotti, whom Audrey married after meeting him on a Mediterranean cruise. With Dotti, Audrey believed she had finally created the stable family life she had longed for. She moved to Italy, embraced domestic routines, and placed her career firmly in the background. But the marriage eventually unraveled. Dotti's repeated infidelities, widely documented by Italian paparazzi, left Audrey deeply hurt. She endured the betrayal quietly for years before. Marriage ended in the early 1980s. Once again, the pattern repeated. Audrey gave everything to the relationship, hoping it would provide the permanence she never had as a child. The last great love of Audrey's life came not from marriage, but from companionship. In Dutch actor Robert Wolders, she found something she had rarely known: trust without fear. They never married, but their relationship was steady, respectful, and emotionally safe. Audrey later said she never worried about losing his love. For the first time, love didn't feel conditional. Each of Audrey Hepburn's relationships explains a different chapter of her life, but none of them defined her the way motherhood did. Her children were the center of her legacy. So she made a decision that stunned the industry. At the height of her fame, she stepped back. This wasn't a dramatic retirement announcement. There was no farewell tour, no public manifesto. Audrey simply began saying no. No to roles that required long separations from her children, to projects that felt emotionally empty, and to a system that valued her image more than her interior life. Hollywood, meanwhile, was also changing. The late 1960s and 70s ushered in a new cinematic language, grittier, more confrontational, more cynical. Audrey's brand of quiet grace no longer fit the moment. Rather than force herself into an industry that no longer reflected her values, she chose distance. That distance preserved her mystique. Had she stayed, her image might have eroded. Instead, it crystallized. When she did return to the screen, it was sparingly and on her own terms. Her later roles were fewer, softer, and more reflective. She wasn't chasing relevance, she was choosing meaning. Her final film appearance, in Always, where she played an angel guiding lost souls, felt less like casting and more like acknowledgement. It was a gentle farewell, but it was fine, because Audrey knew she was unforgettable. But Audrey's most consequential work came after acting. Her commitment to humanitarian work with UNICEF wasn't a reinvention. It was a return. She understood hunger not as theory, but as memory. She understood displacement not as policy, but as lived experience. Where others arrived as ambassadors, she arrived as someone who recognized the pain she was witnessing. Even as her health declined, she refused to stop. That persistence was driven by clarity. She had already been celebrated. She had already been adored. None of that compared to the urgency she felt standing in front of children whose suffering mirrored her own past. When Audrey Hepburn died in 1993, the world mourned an icon. But her true legacy wasn't confined to cinema. She proved that you could step away from fame without abandoning purpose, and that choosing a smaller life, lived deliberately, could be its own kind of success. She didn't need to be remembered as perfect. She wanted to be remembered as real. And that's exactly why she sat in front of the cameras in that forgotten interview and chose complete honesty over whatever Hollywood had tried to tell her to be. Audrey Hepburn has had a career like no other in Hollywood. What do you think of this lost interview? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching.